Welcome to this evening's plenary session. Our speaker tonight is Professor Judith Butler. She is the Maxim Elliott Professor in the Rhetoric and Comparative Literature departments at the University of California in Berkeley. She was born in Cleveland, Ohio, to a family of Hungarian and Russian ancestry. As a child and teenager, she attended both Hebrew school and special classes on Jewish ethics, where she received her first training in philosophy. Professor Butler received her doctorate in philosophy from Yale University in 1984 for a dissertation later published as Subjects of Desire, Hegelian Reflections in 20th Century France. She has published numerous books, including Gender Trouble, Bodies That Matter, The Psychic Life of Power, Precarious Life, Undoing Gender, and Frames of War. Her research ranges from literary theory, modern philosophical fiction, and feminist and sexuality studies to 19th and 20th century European literature and philosophy, Kafka and Loss, Mourning and War. Her forthcoming book from Columbia University Press is Parting Ways, Jewishness, and the Critique of Zionism. In 2009, Professor Butler received the Andrew Mellon Foundation's Distinguished Achievement Award for her contributions to humanistic inquiry. The topic of her lecture tonight is Some New Thoughts on Alliance. Please join me in welcoming Professor Butler.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here, and I'm thinking about all the fabulous dinner reservations you could have had in San Francisco tonight. In any case, I am pleased to be at the American Academy of Religion. I believe this is my third time. I found myself somewhat daunted by the title I assigned to myself some months ago. And perhaps this evening I will speak less about solidarity than about alliance, since here we are in this mainly academic setting as people are gathering across this nation and several others to contest various issues, including despotic rule, economic injustice, sometimes challenging capitalism itself or some of its contemporary forms. And other times, possibly at the same time, they are amassing in public together in order to be seen and heard as a plural political presence and force. Of course, these are different assemblies, different alliances. I do not believe that one can come up with a single account of what all these public demonstrations and movements mean right now. But I am struck by a few features of these assemblies that I would like to consider with you this evening. The first is that we might see these mass demonstrations as a collective rejection of socially and economically induced precarity. The second is that what we are seeing when bodies assemble in the street, in the square, or in other public venues is the exercise, one might call it performative, of plural rights, a form of politics that takes the form of a bodily demand for more livable lives. As we are no doubt aware, neoliberal economics increasingly structures public institutions, including schools and universities, as well as public services, with the consequence that people are losing their homes, their pensions, and their prospects for work in increasing numbers. And this in the United States, but also in several other countries at the same time. We are faced, I think, with the idea that some populations are considered disposable. There is short-term work or post-Fordist forms of flexible labor that rely on the substitutability and dispensability of working peoples, bolstered by prevailing attitudes toward health insurance and Social Security that suggest that market rationality should decide whose health and life should be protected and whose health and life should not. This was, I think, for some of us keenly exemplified at that well-publicized Tea Party meeting in which one member suggested that those who have serious illness and cannot pay for health insurance would simply have to die. A shout of joy apparently rippled through that crowd, according to published reports. It was, I conjecture, the kind of joyous shout that usually accompanies going to war or other forms of nationalist fervor. But if this was for some a joyous occasion, one of festive cruelty, as Nietzsche would call it, it must be precisely because of a belief that those who do not make sufficient wages or who are not in secure enough employment do not deserve to be covered by health care, and that none of the rest of us are responsible for those people. We might ask, under what economic and political conditions do such joyous forms of cruelty emerge? What was the notion of responsibility invoked by that crowd? If each of us is only responsible for ourselves and not for others, and if that responsibility is first and foremost a responsibility to become economically self-sufficient under conditions when self-sufficiency is structurally undermined, then we can see that this neoliberal morality, as it were, demands self-sufficiency as a moral ideal at the very same time that it works to destroy that very possibility at an economic level. Those who cannot afford to pay into health care constitute but one version of a population deemed disposable. Those who are conscripted into the army with a promise of skills, training, and work, sent into zones of conflict where there's no clear mandate and where their lives are at risk of being destroyed, and are sometimes destroyed, are also a version of a disposable population. They are lauded as essential to the nation at the same time that their lives are considered forfeitable. And all those who see the increasing gap between rich and poor, who understand themselves to have lost several forms of security and promise, also understand themselves as abandoned by a government and a political economy that clearly augments wealth for the very few at the expense of the general population. So this leads me to another point. When people amass on the street, one implication seems clear. They are still here and still there. They persist. They assemble and so manifest the understanding that their situation is shared, is social, and even when they are not speaking or do not present a set of negotiable demands, the call for justice is nevertheless being enacted. The bodies assemble, say, we are not disposable, whether or not they are using words at the moment. What they say, as it were, is that we are still here, persisting, demanding greater justice and a release from precarity. We are demanding a possibility of a livable life. Now, to demand justice is, of course, a strong thing to do. It also involves every activist in a philosophical problem. What is justice, and what are the means through which the demand for justice can be made? The reason it is said sometimes that there are no demands when bodies assemble, as has been said of the Occupy Wall Street movement, is that the list of demands would not exhaust the meaning of justice that is being demanded. In other words, we can all imagine just solutions to healthcare, public education, housing, the distribution and availability of food, employment. In other words, we could itemize the injustices in the plural and present those as a set of specific demands, although I would suggest that the list would be very long. But perhaps the demand for justice that is present in each of those demands also necessarily exceeds that list. This was, as we know, a Platonic point, but we don't have to subscribe to a theory of forms to see other ways in which it might operate. For when bodies gather as they do to express their indignation and to enact their plural existence in public space, they are also making broader demands. They're demanding to be recognized, to be valued. They're exercising a right to appear, to exercise freedom to speak their no and their yes, and they're demanding a livable life. And performatively, we might say, they are opposing induced precarity. Now, in some economic and political theory, we hear about populations that are increasingly subject to what is called precaritization. This is a process usually induced and reproduced by governmental and economic institutions that seek to acclimatize populations over time to insecurity and hopelessness. It is structured into the institutions of temporary labor, as I've mentioned, of decimated social services, of the general attrition of social democracy in favor of entrepreneurial modalities supported by fierce ideologies of individual responsibility, and even the obligation to maximize one's own market value as the ultimate aim in life. In my view, this important process of precaritization has to be supplemented by an understanding of precarity as a structure of affect, as Lauren Berlant has suggested when she describes it as a kind of slow death, a heightened sense of expendability or disposability that is differentially distributed throughout society. In addition, I use a third term, precariousness, which characterizes every embodied and finite human being and non-human beings as well. And this is not simply an existential truth. Each of us could be subject to deprivation, injury, debilitation, or death by virtue of events or processes outside of our control, to be sure. But it is also, importantly, a feature of what we might call the social bond, the various relations that establish our interdependency. In other words, no one person suffers a lack of shelter without there being a social failure to organize shelter in such a way that it is accessible to each and every person. And no one person suffers unemployment without there being a system or a political economy that fails to safeguard against that possibility. This means that in some of our most vulnerable experiences of social and economic deprivation, what is revealed is not only our precariousness as individual persons, though that is surely revealed as well, but also the failures and inequalities of socioeconomic and political institutions. In our individual vulnerability to precarity, we are already implicated in a broader social world, a set of networks that work or fail to work, or work only episodically, and a set of bonds that ideally establish our mutual dependency and imply a political imperative to devise collective institutional solutions for the problem of socially induced precarity. The mass demonstrations on the street, in the square, in this last year are very often motivated by different political purposes. But I do think something similar happens. Bodies congregate, they move and speak together, they stay in place together, they attempt to provide provisional shelter for one another, they sleep, eat, and sometimes sing together, and in all these ways they lay claim to a certain space as public, precisely by occupying that space. Perhaps this is nothing new, perhaps this has always happened. But how precisely do we begin to describe this agency on the street and of the street? It could be said simply, well, these demonstrations, these movements are characterized by embodied subjects who come together to make a claim in public space. And yet that formulation presumes that public space is given, that it's already public and recognized as such. In addition, we miss something of the point of public demonstrating if we fail to note that the very public character of the space is being disputed, fought over when these crowds gather. So though these movements have depended on the prior existence of pavement, street, and square, and have often enough gathered in squares like Tahrir, whose political history is potent, it's equally true that the collective actions collect the space itself, gather the pavement, and animate and organize the architecture. As much as we must insist on there being material conditions for public assembly and public speech, we have also to ask how it is that assembly and speech reconfigure the materiality of public space and produce or reproduce the public character of that material environment. And when crowds move outside the square or the university commons to the side street or the back alley, to the neighborhoods where streets are not yet paved, then something more happens. At such a moment, politics is no longer defined as the exclusive business of a public sphere, radically distinct from a private one, but politics rather crosses that line time and again, bringing attention to the way that politics is already in the home or on the street or in the neighborhood or in all those threshold spaces in between. And indeed, even in those virtual spaces that are unbound by the architecture of the public square. So when we think about what it means to assemble in a crowd, a growing crowd, what it means to move through public space in a way that contests the distinction between public and private, we see some ways that bodies in their plurality lay claim to the public, find and produce the public through seizing and reconfiguring the matter of material environments. At the same time, those material environments become part of the action. They themselves act when they become the support for action. When trucks or tanks suddenly become platforms for speakers, then the material environment is actively reconfigured and refunctioned, to use the Brechtian term. And our ideas of action and agency need then to be rethought. In the first instance, no one mobilizes a claim to move and assemble freely without moving and assembling together with others. Moreover, the square and the street are not only the material supports for action, but they themselves are part of any public and corporeal action that takes place. As we know from disability studies and performance studies both, human action depends upon all sorts of supports. It is always supported action, even if the supports are only manifestly shoes and roads. But in the case of public assemblies, we see quite clearly that there's a struggle not only over what will be public space, but a struggle as well over those basic ways in which we are as bodies supported in the world. And so a struggle against disenfranchisement, effacement, and abandonment, an embodied and plural performative struggle against precarity. Of course, this produces a quandary. We cannot act without supports, yet we must struggle for the supports that allow us to act. For Hannah Arendt in The Human Condition, she saw the matter this way, and I quote to you, "The polis, properly speaking, is not the city-state in its physical location. It is the organization of the people as it arises out of acting and speaking together. And its true space lies between people living together for this purpose, no matter where they happen to be," end quote. The true space then lies between the people, which means that as much as any action takes place in a located somewhere, it also establishes a space that belongs properly to alliance itself. For Hannah Arendt, this alliance is not tied to its location. In fact, alliance brings about its own location, highly transposable. She writes, and I quote again, "Action and speech create a space between the participants which can find its proper location almost anywhere and any time," end quote. So how do we understand this highly, if not hyper-transposable conception of political space? Whereas Arendt maintains that politics requires the space of appearance, she also claims that that space is precisely what politics brings about. I quote again, "It is the space of appearance in the widest sense of the word, namely, the space where I appear to others as others appear to me, where men, sick, exist, not merely like other living or inanimate things, but make their appearance explicitly," end quote. Surely something of what she says here is true. Space and location are created through plural action. And yet her view suggests that action in its freedom and its power has the exclusive power to create location. And such a view forgets or refuses that action is always supported, that it is invariably bodily, even in its virtual forms. The material supports for action are not only part of action, they are also what is being fought about, especially in those cases when the political struggle is about food, employment, mobility, and access to institutions. To rethink the space of appearance in order to understand the power and effect of public demonstrations for our time, we will need to understand the bodily dimensions of action, what the body requires and what the body can do, especially when we must think about bodies together, what holds them there, their conditions of persistence and power. Now, I do not mean to come up with generalizations that will apply to all the public demonstrations during 2011. That would include those directed against tyrannical regimes in North Africa and the Middle East, but also those fighting the escalating precaritization of working peoples in Europe and in the Southern Hemisphere and in the United States. We would have to include as well the struggles for public education throughout the US and Europe, in Chile, the Occupy movement, and those struggles to make the streets safe for women, gender, and sexual minorities, including trans people whose public appearance is too often punishable by both legal and illegal violence. Very often the claim that is being made is that the streets must be made safe from the police who are complicit in criminality, criminal regimes or criminal attacks, or when the police commit the very crimes against sexual and gender minorities they are supposed to stop. Or when, in order to protect public space or the rights of state property, they brutally violate the constitutional rights of assembly and freedom of speech, as we've seen recently at the University of California at Davis and earlier at Berkeley. Demonstrations are, I think, even though they do produce targets for police and military violence, they are still one of the very few ways that police power is overcome, especially when amassed populations become too large and too mobile to be contained by police power, or when they're flashing their cell phones and their video capacities in the face of police, which I think is a very important thing to do, and when they have resources to regenerate themselves. Perhaps these are anarchist moments or anarchist passages when the legitimacy of a regime or the appropriateness of a police force is called into question, but when no new regime has yet come to take its place and no or the police force, or when there is no police force to guarantee the rights of assembly, indeed, when the police force is attacking the rights of assembly itself. We might say that this time, this unknown time, this unprotected time is a time of the interval. It's the time of the popular will, by which I don't mean a single will, certainly not a unitary will, but rather one that is characterized by an alliance with the performative power to lay claim to the public in a way that is not yet codified into law, and that, I would add, can never be fully codified into law. How do we understand this acting together that opens up time and space outside and against the temporality and established architecture of existing regimes, that lays claim to materiality, leans into and draws from its supports in order to rework their political functions? Such an action reconfigures what will be public and what will be the space of politics. Indeed, when crowds gather, they exercise their right to gather free of intimidation and threat of violence that is systematically attacked by the police or by the army or by mercenaries on hire by both the state and corporate powers. Indeed, to attack the body that is assembled there is to attack the right of assembly itself, since the right is precisely what is exercised by the body on the street. Although the bodies on the street are vocalizing their opposition to the legitimacy of the state or of an economic condition or set of institutions, they are also, by virtue of occupying that space, repeating that occupation of space, persisting in that occupation of space, posing the challenge in corporeal terms, which means that when the body speaks politically, it is not only in vocal or written language. The persistence of the body calls that legitimacy into question and does so precisely through a performativity of the body that includes movement, stillness, bracing, leaning, holding, linking, going limp, holding one another's arms, gesturing, singing, chanting, and speaking. In other words, it's not that bodily action and gesture always have to be translated into the form of linguistic or verbal demands, but rather that both action and gesture signify and speak as action and claim, and that the one is not finally extricable from the other. Where the legitimacy of the state is brought into question precisely by that way of appearing in public, the body itself exercises a right that is no right, that is to say, no established or codified right. Indeed, it exercises a right that's being actively contested and destroyed by military or police forces, and which in its resistance to force articulates its persistence and its right to persist. That right is codified nowhere. It's not granted from elsewhere or by existing law, even if it sometimes finds support precisely there. It is, in fact, what Arendt calls the right to have rights, neither grounded in natural law nor derived from metaphysical stipulation, but understood rather as the persistence of the body against those forces that seek to monopolize legitimacy and violence. A persistence that requires the mobilization of space and that cannot happen without a set of material supports, mobilized and mobilizing. The freedom of assembly is thus linked with the rights that any population has to appear on the street or in public without fear of attack or deportation, and these entitlements to bodily safety are linked, legally and politically, to the equal right to a livable life, supported and sustained. On the one hand, these bodies on the street are productive and performative, living out an Arendtian notion of action. On the other hand, they can only persist and act when they are in fact supported by environments, nutrition, work, modes of sociality, and belonging, thus defeating the divisions of labor upon which Arendt's The Human Condition relies. And when these supports fall away, mobilization seize upon the supports that still remain in order to claim that there can be no embodied life without social and institutional support, without ongoing employment, without networks of interdependency and care. They struggle for the idea of social support and political enfranchisement, but they also seek to enact a new social form that articulates interdependency itself. And so, in the most ideal instances, however transient, an alliance enacts the social order it seeks to bring about. And when this happens, and it does happen, we have to be mindful of two important caveats. The first is that the alliance is not reducible to individuals, and it is not, strictly speaking, individuals who act. The second is that action in alliance happens precisely between or among those who participate. And this is not an ideal or empty space. It is the space of support itself, of durable and livable material environments, and of interdependency among living beings. It's not only that many of the massive demonstrations and modes of resistance we've seen in the last months produce a space of appearance in the Arendtian sense, They also seize upon an already established space permeated by existing power, seeking to sever the relation between the public space, the public square, and the existing regime. So the limits of the political are exposed, and the link between the theater of legitimacy and public space is severed. That theater is no longer unproblematically housed in established public space, since public space now occurs in the midst of another action, one that displaces the power that claims legitimacy precisely by taking over the field of its effects. Simply put, the bodies on the street redeploy the space of appearance in order to contest and negate the existing forms of political legitimacy. And just as they sometimes fill or take over public space, the material history of those structures also work on them, become part of their very action, remaking a history in the midst of its most concrete and sedimented artifices. These are subjugated and empowered actors who seek to wrest legitimacy from an existing state apparatus or a set of economic institutions that depends upon the public space of appearance for its theatrical self-constitution. In wresting that power, a new space is created, a new between of bodies, as it were, that lays claim to existing space through the action of a new alliance. Those bodies are seized and animated by those existing spaces in the very acts by which they reclaim and re-signify their meanings. These re-significations, as I've suggested, sometimes take explicit verbal or linguistic form, but the performativity of politics is not restricted to the speech act, understood as the efficacious vocalization of action. Bodies enact that performativity as they enter or lay claim to the materiality of public space, as they enter into the historicity of that materiality, and especially as it sometimes breaks with one temporal regime and enters another. In Hannah Arendt's work, one sees the operation of a very strong idea of the political performative. In acting, we bring the space of politics into being, understood as the space of appearance. And in The Human Condition, she valorizes the speech act, the act in the public square where we define justice and lay claim to it verbally as the ultimate action, the speech act itself. And yet she cannot account for the ways in which the established architecture and topographies of power act upon us or enter into our actions, sometimes foreclosing our entry into the political sphere or making us differentially apparent within that sphere. Then one must supplement, if not undercut, Arendt's view with another operation of power. If there is a spatial restriction and allocation of who may appear, in effect, deciding in advance who may become a subject of appearance, then this suggests a different operation of power. To work within these two forms of power, performative power on the one hand, and the regulation of who may appear, linked with the differential allocation of precarity on the other, we have to think about bodies in ways that Hannah Arendt does not do. We will have to think about space as acting on us, even as we act within it, or even when sometimes our actions, considered as plural or collective, bring it into being. I wonder if I could have a little bit of that. Thank you. For those of you who know The Human Condition, a quite problematic division of labor persists throughout Hannah Arendt's work, one that depends on the difference between the reproduction of life that happens in the private sphere and the making of works, or the spoken form of action, which characterizes politics, both of which happen in the public sphere. And when the making of works or the political speech acts define the exercise of power, we're no longer able to consider that other operation of power, the one that explains the exclusions that found her idea of the political. This is only one among many reasons we must think critically about her position. If we appear, we must be seen, which means that our bodies must be viewed and their vocalized sounds must be heard. The body must enter the visual and audible field. And yet we have to ask why, if this is so, Is the body itself divided into the one that appears publicly to speak and act, and another that fails to appear, sexual and laboring, feminine, foreign and mute, one generally relegated to the private and pre-political sphere? That body operates as a precondition for appearance, and so becomes the structuring absence that governs and makes possible the public sphere. So what Hannah Arendt gives us is a map of disavowal, more specifically, the disavowal of interdependency as itself a political issue, one that we see being lived out now as forms of neoliberalism establish dispensable populations and decimate the ideas of social democracy, including health insurance and public rights to shelter, food, and education. This disavowal of interdependency is linked with the notion that the biological requirements of life can be simply set aside from the basic concerns of politics. If we are living organisms who speak and act, then we are clearly related to a vast continuum or network of living beings. We not only live among them, but our persistence as living organisms depends on that matrix of sustaining interdependent relations. If our speaking and acting is supposed to distinguish us as something separate from that other corporeal realm, we have to ask whether there really are two different bodies at issue here. It seems to me that we have to be able to consider the body in its receptivity, precarity, and its persistence, its sexuality, and its labor, as the same body as the body who speaks and acts in public. And once we begin this process, we can then also begin to understand in a new way what is that between or among of bodies from which action emerges, a between that links and mobilizes at once. The rights that Hannah Arendt has in mind are spoken and declared. They're constituted through forms of linguistic action. The only way the body enters that scene is through becoming an active speaking being. And the plurality of which she speaks, even the equality to which she refers, is an equality among those who can stand publicly and speak their rights into being in the ways that she describes. But what if it is the body that makes its demand without language, or even when there is language? It's the various movements of bodies together, as well as their standing still or standing firm, that constitutes the way of forming plural rights. For the claim of equality is not only spoken or written, but is made precisely when bodies appear together, or rather when, through their action, they bring the space of appearance into being. Even though bodies appear to one another and are constituted in part by perspectives that they themselves cannot know, it's equally true that plural bodies also live with one another, depend upon each other for food, shelter, and what is generally called the reproduction of basic needs, or the material reproduction of life. I want to suggest that there's a specific performativity to the so-called private sphere that is also a non-linguistic exercise of rights. The rights to be sheltered, to have food, to lean upon others, to have a durable infrastructure of support that allows one to act and move, or indeed to speak up or speak out. In other words, the equality that Arendt reserves for speakers who bring rights and politics into being through speech not only depends upon the active and speaking body, but it fails to account for those ways of organizing bodily interdependency that sustain the human organism itself, including its capacity to speak. Another way of saying this is that for Arendt, the space of politics is one in which we all appear to one another, and though there are reasons not to demean the importance of the visual field for the constitution of the political, it should be remembered that the sphere of appearance is the full field of the sensible and the senses, including how bodies eat and smell, how they work, how they engage in sexual relations, how they sleep. This means that if there's to be an equality among bodies, it will not be one that is restricted to their capacity to undertake the performative as a verbal speech act alone. Forms of eating and working together, sleeping and cleaning, assembling together against injustice or inequality or the deprivation of freedom will not be reducible to the specific exercise of linguistic power that distills from all those actions their force and meaning. What is meaning is not only a political understanding of the precarity of life, but an idea of plurality or alliance that would form in active resistance to the radically unequal distribution of precarity. To say that bodies are precarious means that they depend fundamentally on social structures and institutions in order to survive. It's not only or primarily a statement about their existential condition, but a way of confirming that lives are bound up with other living processes that exceed those that distinguish human life, and also with social forms that variously work or fail to establish the possibility of livable lives. I hope to have suggested that another order of power operates prior to the kind of performativity that Arendt tends to associate with public speech acts. For if some can legitimately appear and others cannot, how do we understand the public assemblies of the stateless, the undocumented, and the precarious? Any theory of performative action that presumes that the sphere of appearance is open to anyone who can act in that way must first give an account of how the sphere of appearance is differentially structured, foreclosing the appearance of some so that when they do appear, they are called various names, like unruly mobs or disorganized activists or sanitary threats or visual blights. What forms do alliance and political emergence take such that they seek to expose and resist the differential distribution of precarity? It seems to me that we have to rethink plural actors, not only as appearing to one another, but also as living among one another, as lives that depend on social forms, and whose inequality is often the result of political and economic institutions of inequality. And so we have to think, I believe, political performativity as what happens when precarious bodies, knowing their dependency on working infrastructures and sustaining social forms, fight against their economic and social condition, which includes their sense of a damaged future and a persistent anxiety about how one will live. If a we emerges from such a resistance, it's not only to call for a form of social and economic equality that would overcome the differential distribution of precarity. It's also a we, a plurality, who performatively struggles to enact that very social form among themselves, to bring that very political possibility into the world. We know that this is not a simple or always harmonious solidarity. It involves antagonism, hostility, and strain. And sometimes those who find themselves next to one another on the street or in the square never really chose that proximity, but have to deal with it anyway. In a longer project, I'm thinking about this unwilled or involuntary form of bodily proximity that takes form in assemblies and alliances such as these. Whoever we are at such moments, we are at once thrown together even as we assemble there, and we find ourselves next to those we never knew and never chose, and yet we are there for the purposes at hand, and in some strange way, we are also for one another. In 2010 in Ankara, Turkey, I attended an international conference against homophobia and transphobia. This was an especially important event in Ankara, the capital of Turkey, where transgendered people are often served fines for appearing in public, are often beaten, sometimes by the police, and where murders of transgendered women in particular have taken place nearly once a month in recent years. If I offer you this example of Turkey, it's not to point out that Turkey is behind, something that the embassy representative from Denmark was quick to point out to me, and which I declined to accept with equal speed. I assure you that there are equally brutal murders outside of Los Angeles and Detroit, in Wyoming and Louisiana, harassment and beatings in Baltimore, as we know, and in Penn Station in New York City. What was astonishing to me about the alliances that gathered there was that several feminist organizations worked with queer, gay, lesbian, and transgendered people against police violence, but they were also struggling against militarism, against nationalism, and against the forms of masculinism by which those militarism and nationalism were supported. So on the street after the conference, the feminists lined up with the drag queens, the genderqueer with the human rights activists, dressed quite appropriately, the lipstick lesbians with their bisexual and heterosexual friends, and the march included in equal numbers secularists and Muslims. They chanted, "We will not be soldiers and we will not kill." To oppose the police violence against trans people was, in that instance, to be openly against military violence and the nationalist escalation of militarism. It was also to be against the military aggression against the Kurds and also, importantly, acting in the memory of the Armenian genocide and against modes of disavowal on the part of states that continue their violence in other ways. So in Turkey, the feminists took to the streets with the trans activists, but in many feminist circles, there continues to be resistances against making that kind of alliance. In France, for instance, some feminists who understand themselves as left, even materialist, have converged on the idea that transsexuality is a kind of pathology. Of course, there is a distinction between criminalizing queer and transgendered people who appear in public and the pathologization of them as ill. The first position is a moral one, usually based on a spurious conception of public morality. To criminalize a population not only deprives them of protection against the police and other forms of public violence, but it seeks to undermine the political movement struggling for decriminalization and enfranchisement. But to shift to the illness model, or indeed the psychosis model, as some would have it, is to recruit a pseudo-scientific explanation for the purposes of discrediting certain embodied modes of existence that do no harm to others. Indeed, the pathologization model also works to undermine the political movement for enfranchisement, since the explanation implies that such sexual and gender minorities need treatment rather than rights. As a result, we should also be wary of those efforts to grant transsexuals rights, as the Spanish government has done at the very same time that it adopts mental health standards that pathologize those very populations whose legal rights they publicly defend. In another example, in 2006, undocumented Mexican workers laid claim to their rights through singing the American anthem in public and in Spanish. They were laying claim to that right in and by the vocalization itself, but also by the assembly of bodies in the street. And those who fought against the expulsion of the Roma, the gypsies from France, speak not only for the Roma, but against the arbitrary and violent power of a state to expel into statelessness a segment of its population, literally overnight. Similarly, we can say that state authorization for the police to arrest and deport women who wear the burqa or the niqab in France is another example of a discriminatory action that targets a minority and which clearly denies their rights to appear in public as they will. French feminists who call themselves universalists have called upon the police to arrest, detain, fine, and sometimes deport women wearing the niqab or the burqa on the streets. What sort of politics is this that recruits the police function of the state to monitor and restrict women from religious minorities in the public sphere? Why would the same universalists, Elizabeth Badinter, for instance, openly affirm the rights of transgendered people to freely appear in public without police harassment at the same time that they support police detentions of Muslim women who happen to wear religious clothing in public? Those who supported such a ban argued in the name of a universalist feminism, claiming that the niqab and the burqa offend the sensibilities of universalism. But what kind of universalism is it that is grounded in a very specific secular tradition and that fails to honor the rights of religious minorities? Even if one stayed within the problematic framework of that universalism, it would be difficult to come up with a coherent and non-contradictory criterion for why transgendered people should be protected against police violence and given every right to appear in public, while Muslim women and neither Christian nor Jewish women are to be deprived of the right to appear in public in ways that signify their religious affiliation and belonging. If rights can be universalized only for those who abide by secular norms or who belong to religions that are eligible for protection under the law, then surely the universal itself is emptied of meaning, or worse, becomes an instrument of discrimination, racism, and exclusion. If the right to appear is to be honored universally, it would not be able to survive such an obvious and insupportable contradiction. Contrast this situation, if you will, with that time of the revolution in Egypt when forms of unpredictable equality emerged between those of different religious traditions and those who were clearly not religious at all. We've seen how that ideal did not always hold, but it remains true that certain important principles of equality and alliance were articulated then and are continuing to be articulated when alliances come together to exemplify the kind of social and political bonds of interdependency and equality that they see so clearly lacking in hierarchical and exploitative economic and political orders. Although I am aware that the fate of the Egyptian revolution remains uncertain, especially as the transitional military government refuses to honor any deadline for ceding to civil rule, I still want to underscore two aspects of the revolutionary demonstrations in Tahrir Square, and I'll end with these. The first has to do with the way a certain sociability was established within the square, a division of labor that broke down gender difference, that involved rotating who would speak and who would clean the areas where people slept and ate, developing a work schedule for everyone to maintain the environment, to clean the toilets, to make the food. In short, what some would call horizontal relations among the protesters formed easily and methodically, and quickly it seemed that relations of equality, which included an equal division of labor between the sexes, became part of the very resistance to Mubarak's regime and its entrenched hierarchies, including the extraordinary differentials of wealth between the military and corporate sponsors of the regime and the working people. So the social form of the resistance began to incorporate principles of equality that govern not only how and when people spoke and acted for the media and against the regime, but how people cared for the various quarters within the square, the beds on pavement, the makeshift medical stations and bathrooms, the places where people ate, the places where people were exposed to violence from the outside. These actions were all political in the simple sense that they were breaking down a conventional distinction between public and private in order to establish relations of equality. In this sense, they were incorporating into the very social form of resistance the principles for which they were struggling on the street. The second point I want to make has to do with the careful relation to violence that was cultivated in that time. When up against violent attack or extreme threats, many people chanted the words silmiya, which comes from the root verb salima, which means to be safe and sound, unharmed, unimpaired, intact, safe, and secure, but also to be unobjectionable, blameless, faultless, and also to be certain, established, clearly proven. The term comes, as I understand it, from the noun silm, which means peace, but also, interchangeably and significantly, the religion of Islam. One variant of the term is hub as-silm, which is Arabic for pacifism. Most usually, the chanting of silmiya comes across as a gentle exhortation, peaceful, peaceful. Although the revolution was for the most part nonviolent, it was not necessarily led by a principled opposition to violence. Rather, the collective chant was a way of encouraging people to resist the mimetic pull of military aggression and the aggression of the gangs by keeping in mind the larger goal, radical democratic change. To be swept into a violent exchange of the moment was to lose the patience needed to realize the revolution. What interests me here is the chant, the way in which language worked not to incite an action, but to restrain one. The chant structured affect in the direction of community and nonviolence, calling for and enacting a nonviolent mode of politics. Of course, an ambiguity emerges precisely there, since resisting a violent attack does take some force. One has to sometimes forcibly resist a forcible attack. And this means that nonviolence is not a form of passivity, but rather the thoughtful cultivation of forceful resistance that refuses to replicate the aggression it opposes, and for whom restraint itself is the nonviolent cultivation of force. Although some may wager that under conditions of new media or social networking, the exercise of rights now takes place quite at the expense of bodies on the street, that Twitter and other virtual technologies have led to the disembodiment of the public sphere, I disagree. The media requires those bodies on the street to have an event, even as the street requires the media to exist in a global arena. But under conditions when those with cameras or internet capacities are imprisoned or tortured or deported, then the use of the technology effectively implicates the body. Not only must someone's hand tap and send, but someone's body is on the line if that tapping and sending gets traced. In other words, localization is hardly overcome through the use of a media that potentially transmits globally. And if this conjuncture of street and media constitutes a very contemporary version of the public sphere, then bodies on the line have to be thought as both there and here, now and then, transported and stationary, with very different political consequences following from those two modalities of space and time. Finally, then, it matters that it's public squares that are filled to the brim, that it's the middle of universities, that it's the commons, that people eat and sleep there, sing and refuse to cede that space, as we saw in Tahrir Square and continue to see on a daily basis. After all, in Cairo, it was not just that people amassed in the square. They were there, they slept there, they dispensed medicine and food, they assembled and sang and spoke. Can we distinguish those bodily vocalizations from other forms of enacting a more egalitarian social form, one that manifested equality as a feature of interdependency itself? They were, after all, sleeping and eating in the public square, constructing toilets, very systems for sharing the space. So not only refusing to be sent home or to have their issues shadowed, and not only claiming the public domain for themselves, acting in concert on conditions of equality, they were also maintaining bodies with needs, desires, and requirements. Arendtian and counter-Arendtian, to be sure. Since these bodies who were organizing their most basic needs in public were also petitioning the world to register what was happening there, to make its support known, and in that way to enter into revolutionary action itself. The bodies acted in concert, they also slept in concert, and in both these modalities, they were both vulnerable and demanding, giving political and spatial organization to elementary bodily needs. In this way, they formed themselves into images to be projected to all of us who watched, petitioning us to receive and respond, and so enlisting media coverage that would refuse to let the event be covered over or to slip away. Sleeping on that pavement was not only a way to lay claim to the public, to contest the legitimacy of the state, but also, quite clearly, a way to put the body on the line in its insistence, obduracy, and precarity, overcoming the distinction between public and private for the time of revolution. In other words, it was only when those needs that are supposed to remain private came out into the day and night of the square, formed into image and discourse for the media, did it finally become possible to extend the space and time of the event with such tenacity to bring the regime down. After all, the cameras never stopped. Bodies were there and here. They never stopped speaking, not even in sleep, and so could not be silenced, sequestered, or denied. Revolution happened because everyone refused to go home, cleaving to the pavement, acting in concert. And yet, what do we do when police force overwhelms such scene? My brief suggestion is that even as the police sweep away encampments in Zuccotti, in Portland, in Oakland, and elsewhere, there is no telling when bodies may congregate and reenact the space of politics, reappearing here and there, now and then. And even if this is an ephemeral politics, that does not mean it is not repeated. It means it is. The requirement to bring the space of politics into being does not depend on this or that place. This is a movable movement, and it moves, and it takes place. Thank you. Thank you.
You still want to take questions?
What time is it?
This is, we have 10 minutes.
Okay, I'll take a few.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Butler. And we have about 10 minutes for question and answer. In order to use the time wisely, I would like to ask you to make your question as concise as possible. And there are the mics in the aisle that you can use.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask you to comment on the violence toward women that occurred in Tahrir Square and how you would evaluate that or think about that.
Well, in fact, I think we've seen instances of violence against women in many of the assemblies that have happened in the last year, and not just in Tahrir Square, but in Zuccotti Park and other places. And so the real question becomes, what is the work that has to be done internal to those communities in order to establish principles of nonviolence and of care and of bodily integrity and of the equal rights of women, put broadly. I think that we find those instances in all of these assemblies, and I think it's one of the risks of assembling in public as bodies who live and eat and sleep together. It is one of those risks, and it poses a demand for those communities to work that out. I actually was part of a conversation with some of the people who were in Zuccotti Park, who were trying to come to terms with that, and it was really clear that that community needed to be forming and discussing those values and those politics in ways that they had not yet done, or that they'd not yet done extensively enough. But I wouldn't single out Tahrir Square. I think that's a problem across the board.
With an ethic of alliance, would the adjudication in some ways of that ethic have to do with that which pushes people towards precariousness? That is, if you were trying to figure out how do I act in an alliance, is the thing that threatens the alliance that which pushes things to precariousness? And I'm thinking about this in the age of incarceration in terms of trying to rethink that which is threatening and that with which I should be forging alliance.
I'm trying to see if I understand your question correctly, and I'm not sure I do. It seems like you were asking about what adjudicates that ethic, and then you suggested that there was a push towards increased precarity, and I wasn't quite sure how those two remarks related to one another.
In your speech, what I was struck by was precariousness as a situation of danger, alliance as a possibility for action. It seems like alliance, part of what's important about alliance is the ability to respond back against precariousness. Precariousness is one of the threats. So does it become, if one is trying to develop an ethic for how alliance works, is precariousness the thing by which one determines?
Okay, maybe I can help by approaching this in a slightly different way. For me, the opposite of precariousness, the term you used, is not security. And I'm not sure there, even as much as I am arguing against the differential distribution of precarity, I would be very alarmed if any of us lost our sense of precariousness, right? Because our sense of precariousness is actually our sense of being dependent on others, and it is our sense of sociality to some degree. It's not the only way in, and it's not the only thing that defines that sociality. But if we sought to become impermeable, or if we sought to become radically self-sufficient, or we sought to become securitarian islands of some kind, then we would be losing the point of interdependency. So there has to be a sense of a shared precariousness for there to be a notion of shared interdependency. At the same time, it seems to me we have to struggle against the differential distribution of precarity, that is to say, socially and economically induced forms of precarity that make certain populations more dispensable and less grievable than others. So I actually think the link or the alliance comes out of a sense of yes, precariousness and interdependency and outrage and the struggle for equality and the struggle for a livable life. But I'm not sure we would even have an idea of a livable life if we didn't know what the unlivable was. So I want us to have that in mind. I don't want us to forget that or oppose it as a sense of things. I think it's from that sense of fragility and precarity that we do forge and keep those bonds.
Thank you very much for the talk. And as someone who focuses on contemporary theology and Islamic thought in Turkey, I really appreciate your focus and comments on Turkey as well. I was in Ankara, in fact, in 2010, and I know Nevin Öztop, who translated your...
Great.
And it's been a very good thing you brought attention to that.
Yeah, it was a great demonstration.
Yeah, and I missed the demonstration, but I got to know her.
You missed the demonstration?
I know. I was only there in the summer, I'm afraid to say.
Okay.
But I got to know Kaos pretty well and talked to her. And so I just wonder if you're going to be doing anything on that topic now or will in the future.
Well, I do things on that topic almost every year in different parts of the world, but I don't have anything booked right now.
Well, I appreciate your
I'm
interest.
unbooking myself right now. Yeah. Sorry.
I'm curious if you could speak to the iconic status of wounded and tortured bodies for the kind of motivation and mobilization of protest movements.
I think you're making an assumption that would be, it sounds like that's something you believe is true. And I would have to understand where you see that and why you see that for me to begin to respond to that.
Well, part of that's in the media. I think there's been a lot of coverage of different people who've been both wounded and tortured and how they become iconic kind of representatives of various protest movements. So I didn't know if you had kind of thought about these various instances in which this has happened, if that's crossed your mind at all when you've been thinking about your speech tonight.
So you're talking about what the media does, or you're talking about what the movements do, or you're talking about a...
Well, there's a relationship between the two, because obviously by gaining media representation, groups then kind of use that to their own advantage.
I see. So you see it as an instrumental
Sure.
move on the part of those movements. Okay. Well, we would have to have a longer discussion in which you gave me some examples that would support that thesis, because I can't start with it as a given.
The last question.
Last question.
Part of what I hear you doing, especially with your engagement with Iran, is providing sort of a apologetics for a movement that hasn't been able to produce a sort of a unified speech act. And
You didn't like my talk.
no, not at all, not at all.
That's okay. You don't have to like it.
No,
I mean, I'm here giving my Unified Speech Act. What do you that's
Well,
good, no?
That was exactly my question. Is I wonder if you feel that the movement can succeed if it needs its Unified Speech Act to come in the form of an apologetics from what is admittedly the academic elite.
They don't need me. I'm just trying to, they don't need me at all. I'm just trying to make sense of things in my own way and in my own idiom, which you unfortunately are trained to understand. But look, this is what I want to say about it. I think that when you are when a movement is trying to bring attention to a structural inequality, right? Because it is a structure, it is a sense of an accelerating structural inequality by which wealth is being amassed by the rich who are becoming richer, and it's being lost by a population that is becoming poorer and larger. Okay? Now, I don't think anybody's confused about that particular message. I think that message has gotten out there, right? 99%, 1%. It's out there. The message is out there. But then the question is, oh, well, it's a message, it's not a demand. Well, it's not a demand the way you would make a demand on the union table, like, oh, here are the 6 demands, and after our demands are fulfilled, we'll go home. No, it can't be like that. Because the point is that it is trying to draw attention to a structural inequality and to keep focus on that and to produce, I think, a popular will, a sense of who the democratic we is, that is generally not acknowledged to be the case. And that is really important because it calls into question whether electoral politics and even the well-organized political demand, right? The discourse of the well-organized political demand is ill-equipped to handle the actual idiom of popular sovereignty during this time. So what we're actually seeing is a certain kind of epistemic or discursive rift between the idea of like effective organized politics, like, and I think, Mayor Bloomberg said it. He said, well, after he cleaned up Zuccotti, he said, well, now we'll see whether they can use words rather than bodies. I thought, wow, he's been reading the human condition. As if they weren't already using lots of words. There are many, many, many words, right? But he wants, and the problem with the demand is also demand to whom? It gives power to this mayor or this government to satisfy the demand, at which point it becomes a negotiable item rather than a radical structural change. And I think they are absolutely right to keep it as it is, because what they're actually producing is a different sense of who we are. I think that's one of the most profound changes I've seen.
Thank you very much for coming. And once again, thank you, Professor Butler.